it is the 1st of June, but we just had May, which was Mental Health Awareness Month. And we wanted to start this very important conversation about the overlap between mental health and the nutrition support community. So whether you are a provider, a consumer, a caregiver, however you identify, there are definitely tools that you can take from the information that's going to be given today. Jordan and Terri are mental health professionals, but they are not professionals in the dietary nutrition support world. So we did receive some amazing questions, and we also received some that were very specific to that community. So when we happen upon those, we will touch on them. But a lot of those questions will be answered at our annual conference, which can also be streamed virtually this year. And if we don't have answers for you today, I'm happy to do a little bit of digging and see if I can find you some resources on that question specifically. So with that being said, I want to dive right in. Let me see if it will work for me. Of course, it's not going to. All right, well, rather than fighting with my fancy little PDF, just a couple of things about Zoom. Please stay muted if you are not speaking. Feel free to use the raise hand function if you want to ask a question towards the end. We'll have time for some Q&A. Just a reminder that chats are saved when a webinar is recorded, and this one is being recorded and will be available for later viewing on our website. Thanks, Andrea. There we go. There's my Zoom tips. What would I do without you? So stay muted unless speaking. Participants can choose, except I can't see it now. There we go. To keep video on or off. If your video is on, please stay in one place. Do not give us a tour of your house. I do get car sick. Make sure your space is appropriate and your background is appropriate. Like I said, those are all the functions that you can use. I don't believe we have any polls today because we want to get as much out of this as possible. These will be recorded. We aren't having any breakout sessions today. And like I said, the chat is saved. If you're having any technical difficulties, feel free to drop it in the chat. I am going to be the one sort of facilitating and moderating, but Andrea and a couple of my other coworkers are here and can try to help out to the best of our ability. So with that being said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. All right, I'm going to try to pin our our speakers, I mean. Okay, excellent. So like I said, in the registration process, we asked for any questions that folks may have because we want this to be a dialogue. So before we dive into that, I would love if Jordan and Terri, you could just introduce yourselves, give us a little bit of a rundown on the work that you do, how you got roped into this maybe, and your credentials would be awesome. And I'll get those questions pulled up while you do that. Jordan, if you want to start, that would be great.
Jordan Shaw, I'm the interim student support and development coordinator at the University of Maine at Augusta. I'm a clinical mental health counselor in the state of Maine. And I don't know, Maisie, what else did you want to know?
I think that's pretty much it.
Perfect.
Thanks. Terri, what about you?
Thank you. I was going to say, Jordan, age before beauty, haha. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today and bringing forth your questions and connecting with us. My name is Terri Reiter. I am a licensed clinical social worker, which those licensing credentials are somewhat different state to state, but that basically means an independently licensed mental health clinician. I've worked in a variety of settings, from residential to educational settings, college, mental health, substance abuse and addiction, medical, worked dialysis units and things like that. So I've done a lot, which is surprising since I'm not very old, haha. So anyway, thank you again for joining the important conversation.
Excellent, thank you guys. And like I said, they are not specifically dietitians or nutritionists, but they do have a wide variety of experiences and bring a ton of knowledge and insight to this topic. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. I know you're very busy. And I just want to start off by saying we know that it is a huge issue that there is a general lack of mental health professionals, especially those working with folks with complex medical challenges, special health needs, chronic illnesses, rare diseases. And we are very well aware of that and are working really hard to build out our healthcare directory, which we're hoping to include mental health professionals and just bring some more voices into this conversation. So we know that that is something that is on a lot of people's minds, and anything that is specific to nutrition support, we are going to kind of zoom out and talk about some tips and tricks to work through that in a variety of situations. So I just wanted to preface with that. So are you folks okay if we dive right into our list of questions? Okay, awesome. There were some that I reworded a little bit just for clarity, but if you submitted that question and would like more clarity, feel free to put something in the chat and we can pull from that in a little bit. So one thing with the nutrition support community is that for a variety of reasons, some folks aren't able to eat quote unquote normally. And so one of our first questions was, how can I better deal with the shame of not being able to eat like other people? I always feel like I have to try harder. So I'll let you guys duke it out in terms of who speaks first, and then the other can add.
It's true. We're going to duke it out because both of us are happy to talk. Go ahead, Jordan.
Well, and I wonder if we were actually going to talk about the same thing, in that, you know, I think one of the things to recognize is those feelings of shame, right? And you know, I love what Brene Brown says about shame. It's the narrative of I am bad. And I think if there can be a mindset shift to thinking about, this is something that I navigate aside from carrying around that shame, I think you could really maybe push through some of those feelings or address them in some really concrete ways. The other thing I would say is that people do experience similar feelings if they have restrictive diets of some kind. And so, you know, I'm thinking people with celiacs, for example, can experience the same thing. And it's that's navigating that same thing. It's navigating the fact that there isn't something wrong, right? It's just the way it is. And if you can separate those feelings and move towards maybe, I don't know how I want to say it, but move toward a paradigm shift in some ways. I think you can deal with some of those feelings of shame.
Yeah, I think it's funny. You were right, Jordan. I was going to also bring up Brene Brown and the idea of shame being I am bad, and having differences, no matter what those differences are. You know, I think we would graciously and compassionately offer to anyone other than ourselves is fine, right? Like, what would we say to a 10-year-old who learns that they have diabetes and they aren't able to eat in the ways, in the carefree perhaps ways, although I suggest probably no one really eats totally carefree, but in the ways that are more commonly experienced by people who don't have that condition. I think that, you know, differences are an opportunity, and I think what happens is we have to sort of not take ourselves too seriously sometimes, and we have to use our strength. So for me, sometimes I use humor, as I'm already doing, to dissipate, right? And so, but I've seen people be so creative in the years of practice, whether, you know, I've seen people use art to educate and inform. You know, this individual I worked with, she made these bookmarks about her own medical condition, which was different. And in occasions where she actually had a situation where she wasn't able to have children, people would always ask her as a newly married person, when will you start your family? And she didn't, she got tired of answering it. So she just like used art to create this very little, like small infographic, and she just carried them around like business cards that she'd hand them out, right? And so I think, you know, or playful banter, you know, there are different ways to dissipate some of the tension around feeling and looking different, let's say at a meal time or a table. Owning it as it is, without apology, is probably what we would encourage someone else that we love to do with their challenges and or differences. And that's what I would invite, you know, anyone with this challenge to consider also, is partnering with your people, your tribe, to try on different things that help feel like you're owning it in a positive way. One of the things that I work with one of my teenagers who's highly sensitive is learning to laugh at herself. You know, she takes herself very, very seriously. And it's a strength to loosen some of that up and be okay with sharing vulnerability. It takes courage, but it's a different narrative. And, you know, we have to try that on and see how it feels and find the thing that is authentic for us, that doesn't feel like too much of a stretch, but very different ways to really embrace that difference, and it's okay.
Definitely. I just asked Andrea to find, we have a little resource that's kind of like that bookmark that you mentioned to bring to like restaurants or something. That's just like, basically there was nothing wrong with the food. I just don't eat and it felt weird not to order something. So it's nothing personal, basically. So if that's something that is helpful, that does exist. And I think, like you said, you know, finding your people and finding those who are cool with the fact that you don't eat or eat differently. And I think really like knowing what your deal breakers are and your boundaries are for who's in your circle, and the people who make a big fuss about it or make you uncomfortable about it, like, you know, figure out what your personal boundaries are and stand by those. So thank you both so much. This one's a little bit heavier, but that's why we're here. Do you have any tips on managing losing friends who have the same diagnosis? And I would even expand that to a similar diagnosis or just in this community.
What do you mean by losing friends? Are we talking about death, or are we talking about sort of ending relationships?
Death.
Yeah, okay.
Grieving that.
I think, you know, every time somebody close to us dies, we're faced with our own mortality, and we have to wrestle with the same existential questions. You know, things like, what's the meaning of life? And what's the meaning? How do we move forward? You know, I think recognizing your feelings, recognizing those stages of grief. And it's really interesting because there's somebody that's, and I can't remember their name right now, but they've built on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work and added another stage of grief, and that's to make meaning. And so finding ways to honor those friends that have died in a meaningful or impactful way, whether it's privately or in a more public way. I'm thinking of like, I mean, everybody's heard of Patrick Dempsey, and here in Maine, after his mom died of cancer, he started the Dempsey Center and the Dempsey Challenge and those sorts of things. And that's a wonderful testament of, and a wonderful way to make meaning. He has a lot more resources than the vast majority of us. But finding ways to do something even small at home to remember them and to make meaning from that death.
Yeah, and I would add to that, you know, there are different components to meaning making. There are the ways to honor the individual or individuals that are lost based on who they are and what they represent to you. And for some people, that's creating a ritual of doing something special on the birthday or the anniversary of their passing, or creating some sort of visual reminder of them, pictures, collages, whatnot. But it's also sometimes it's important to dissect what it is that contributed to that situation. Did the individual pass as a direct result of the medical situation, or did depression take that individual's life? Because so often, as you know, we touched upon earlier, and we know chronic medical illness, whether it's pain or an acute condition or whatnot, cancer, you know, it is accompanied by co-occurring mental health situations, anxiety, depression, kind of like you mentioned, Jordan, that when we lose somebody, we are faced with our own mortality too. And that's really difficult. And especially as Crystal is offering, that seeing yourself in that person, that's really terrifying and scary. And hopefully that support system of mental health help and or I'm going to go back to that whole your tribe, like, you know, it's really important to have a couple of key people that you can really say even the darkest, hardest, most difficult, vulnerable things honestly to. You know, you can speak it, and some things you don't even feel like you could possibly utter. You can say to this person, I am having a really bad day. This is what is happening for me. These are my thoughts. I'm having some really dark thoughts, and or I'm terrified, or anxiety is really paralyzing me today, or, you know, naming it. Actually, we can't begin to tame it if we can't name it.
And I'm just going to throw out a shameless plug for a couple of things. If there is somebody in your life specifically that you would like to honor and use that opportunity to make meaning out of, we do have an in loving memory ceremony at our annual conference, which again will be streamed virtually. So if that's something that you would like to take advantage of, please just send either me or Beth or Andrea or Lisa, anybody, an email of who that person is and what they meant to you, and we will make sure that that's included. And regarding building that support system, that circle, we do have support groups for various populations within this community, and those are on our website as well. So if you don't even know where to start, I feel like that is a good place, because it's all people with lived experience who have probably navigated what you're navigating now. So definitely don't hesitate to reach out and tap into those resources. Thank you, guys. All right, I want to make sure we have time to get to some other ones. So this was another question. How do you learn to express gratitude for the things that you do have?
Want me to jump in, Jordan? I think that the key word in that question is learning. For some of us, identifying gratitude is something we have to learn. I mean, for example, I grew up in a household where we were always disaster planning. We were planning for that other shoe to drop, because that was the way you could, you know, really sink into, I guess actually it was sort of the illusion of control. Like if we planned for the worst thing that could happen, then we wouldn't be taken off guard in my household. And so we were, the cup is half empty people. And I actually had to learn how to cultivate gratitude. And one of the best forms of relatively free, low barrier accepting treatments is any of the 12-step programs, whether it's Codependence No More, Al-Anon, Alcoholics Anonymous, because their whole program, their whole premise is based on community, sponsorship, and honestly, cognitive behavioral therapy. And one of the suggestions that they had is to keep a gratitude list of 3 to 5 things every day you're grateful for, and to actually write them down. And one day, this is way too much information, but I was using the restroom in a friend of mine's home, and she had reading material in the bathroom. And one of them was that little book, 14,000 Things to Be Happy About. And as a cup looks half empty person, this was like several years ago, I picked it up and started thumbing through it. And I thought, this is brilliant. Somebody just made a ton of money publishing their gratitude list that they did as part of working the 12-step program, because every day are the 3 things, from chocolate chip cookies to kites in the sky to sunrises, rainbows, flowers blooming. It's training your brain actually to look at and find joy in the little things. I don't know that our brains are naturally hardwired to do that, because I think our brains are hardwired to keep us alive and survival, and they're like heavy, thinkers, our brains. And so we have to actually encourage our brain to lighten up and to find that joy, to seek it out. And some of us have to really encourage that more than others.
You said exactly what I was going to say. That there's a lot of science, and Martin Seligman and Laurie Santos have both done a lot of work around this. And the first step is that gratitude journal. I think after the gratitude journal, you could even take it a step further and doing some of these random acts of kindness. And the trick with the random acts of kindness is you have to do it in person, and you have to see the facial reaction of the person, right? So, or hear them express gratitude for it to have a sustained impact. But there are all kinds of gratitude exercises that you can use to infuse more gratitude. I think also recognizing that we're hardwired for struggle, and it's easy for us to sort of get siloed and forget that everybody has a type of struggle across the board. And so even though it might feel like it's difficult to find things to be grateful for in the moment, doing those exercises helps to also broaden our perspectives enough to see, oh, I'm really struggling, but the person next to me is really struggling too. And together we might be able to find some gratitude.
And I think too, it's setting a scene, right? Setting the intention, right? So some people like to celebrate by lighting a candle, but it's important that or playing their favorite music and lighting a candle. I mean, I can remember when I learned the little things about buy a bag of black beans and put little tea lights in them in a dish that you like on your table, and light 3 candles. And for each one that you light before you have a conversation with somebody, or sit down to read a book, or have a cup of tea, or whatever, practicing that gratitude, make sure that you're looking at something that your senses appreciate, and if that's black candles for you, do it. If it's polka dotted candles, or if it's funky music, or whatever it is, it's about setting the intention for your brain to relax a little bit and ease into practicing that skill.
Thank you. These were 2 that I kind of lumped together, so it's a little bit farther down on your list. But what is the most important thing that both MDs and dietitians can do to assist their nutrition support patients with mental health? And I'm going to link to that just for the sake of time. Are there ways to identify patients who may be dealing with underlying eating disorders or other mental health challenges while on nutrition support? So what can they do to support them? And are there any sort of red flags that they should look out for?
Terry, I'll start and maybe you can follow up, because I'm going to start with a quote from you. You know, Terry is famous for saying, let's slow everything down. Right. So when things get moving too quickly, slow it down and really listen to the person. So I think in terms of what MDs and dietitians might need to keep in mind would be exactly that. We as healthcare professionals move very quickly sometimes. And we do that because it's the world we live in. Like some things are just sort of second nature for those of us who, you know, might be a mental health provider or might be an MD or something like that. But if we can slow it down, our clients will be able to catch up to us, I guess. And we'll be able to break things down that might seem simple to us, but might be pretty complex. I think the other thing, another quote that Terry has is nothing about me without me, right? So I think providers really need to listen to their patients. I have heard more and more stories about people who have struggled with their MDs because the MDs just write off their experiences, or they're not listening to what they know about their bodies. And the one thing I know to be true is patients and clients, they're the experts of their own lives. They live in those bodies, you know.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I love what you said, Crystal, about when things are going slower, it's possible to actually hear. And, you know, hearing is sitting with information in a really different way. And I think what's also important for me personally is to experience any provider I have as embracing me as a whole person, not just the sum of the symptoms that they're asking me about in that moment, you know, that narrow focus, you know, how is this, how is that, you know, our Western medicine is very symptom driven and solution focused for the symptom, right? But I'm a whole person. I'm not just this part, you know, just the earache I'm having right now, you know, what else, right? The body talks to us in so many different ways. And I think for me, it's really important that the providers that I work with have a degree of synchronicity with my thinking. You know, I work better with providers who approach health from a holistic perspective. Because at any given day, even though I'm going to my medical doctor, which is my physical whatever, I could be struggling with more emotional challenges that particular day. And there is very likely a link. They're not actually separate. So I think it's actually having the conversation, having the courage to ask the difficult questions, and being willing to hold the information that you receive. I mean, sometimes people won't ask the question, are you feeling suicidal, for example? Are you feeling hopeless? What's your level of despair? Because they don't want to have to respond to it. And that's probably not a good fit for me as a provider. I want the person who's actually going to have the difficult conversations and be willing, even if they don't have the answer or know what to do, to say, all right, we're going to figure this out and walk through this together.
Thank you. I would add too, just in my experience, you as a provider don't have to know everything, but it can be really beneficial to know who might have the answers, or at least some resources that you can point them to. And we'll work to compile some resources for both patients and providers, and share those. But I think they're in like a comprehensive care team, or a multidisciplinary care team, often mental health is not incorporated in that. Not always, but most often I feel like it's not necessarily prioritized. So knowing who may be a good person for them, or even just somewhere you can point them to help them out. Thank you, guys. If the person who asked this question is here, feel free to clarify in the chat if I get this wrong, but they asked what to do at times when you question what you are going through. So I interpreted that as sort of a, why me? Why is this happening? What did I do to deserve this? Kind of thinking in that mindset, sort of, why is this happening?
I'll jump in, Jordan. I think that question is, again, a common place that my mind likes to go. And here again, this is some years of practice in working with myself. This is not my natural mindset necessarily, but sometimes I can get stuck in my grief moving into a pity party. So I try to actually limit my grief, because a piece of that, why me, is grief. There's a loss associated with that difference, and there's anger about that, sadness about that, that, as Jordan said, that word meaning making, what am I supposed to do with this? How come this is happening right now to me and it's never going to change? I try to set parameters for myself around that and give it, as silly as it sounds, I actually set limits of like, okay, I can get stuck in this loop, this cognitive loop, and I'm going to allow myself an hour to do that. I'm going to play my anger music and I'm going to vacuum and stomp around and be ticked off about it. And at the end of that hour, if I can't change the channel myself, I'm going to dial someone out and say, okay, who wants to be a millionaire? You're my lifeline today. I need to change the channel. Can you help me? Because the most dangerous place for me personally is limiting myself to conversations with my three besties, me, myself, and I. Because if I stay in that conversation, I am going to spiral on a lot of days, which is why I really need people to help me pull myself out, to help me do for myself what I can do, but I need some help to do it. You want to add to that, Jordan?
You said exactly what I was going to say. And I think it goes back to the positive psychology, the gratitude stuff we were talking about too, in that when we shift our mindset, we can accomplish a lot more. I think of a friend of mine, a childhood friend of mine, who has had an untold number of things to navigate throughout her life, both as a child and as an adult. And she's been able to use those experiences to really inspire some other folks, but she also uses them to rally people around her. And if you can see this, if you can move to seeing the strength in some situations, then I think you can use those. But the only way to do that is to do exactly everything that you said, Terri, and I think reach out to people and know your limits. I love the meme, the social media meme that says I schedule my breakdowns. They're at whatever, I think we all should do that.
I think I was just gonna say, I think we kind of live in like a toxic positivity culture where it's like everything happens for a reason. And I think sometimes it stinks, and like you said, Terry, to name that feeling is the first step in being able to work through it. And I think we're often taught to don't be sad, it's okay, like you'll be fine, blah, blah, blah. But like sometimes you just have to sit in it for a little bit and you can't get stuck on it, but just sit in it for a minute.
Absolutely. I think, I always say grief for me, and all of this represents forms of grief. I always use the analogy of the tide at the beach. I feel like grief is like the tide, like it comes in and there's very little beach left sometimes when the tide is in and not as much room to walk. And I think of that as like, I can't really get a deep breath because I'm drowning in the intensity of some emotion that I'd rather not feel or deal with. And also because everything changes, the tide goes out and that feeling passes. But when you're in it, it's hard to remember that it is those waters will recede because that's part of the cycle. That's what happens.
Thank you. That's awesome. I'm going to jump around a little bit just for the sake of time, because there's a couple more that I want to get to that I think are really applicable. We received one. Is there a list of providers familiar with the challenges faced by those with feeding and nutritional difficulties? Currently, not that I'm aware of. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but not that I'm aware of. However, we at Oley are working to build out that healthcare directory that we were talking about, which we're hoping to include mental health professionals who specialize in this community. So that being said, if you know any providers who would be interested in signing up for that, certainly encourage them to do so, especially if they're a mental health provider, a mental health professional, but really anybody in this field. We're trying to build that out so people have kind of a pool to pull from. And another great question, two questions actually, was, is there any research between vitamin deficiencies and depression? I'm not going to put that on Jordan and Terry to answer just because they don't have enough information. Again, however, at our annual conference, there will be a session for both our PN and EN populations to talk about the results of vitamin deficiencies and what to look for and how it can impact the body in a variety of ways. So if you are attending, that will be available, again, both in person and virtually, since it's one of our general sessions. And lastly, what role does sleep deprivation play as well due to infusing TPN at night? And we do have a session about infusing during the day versus infusing at night. So I think there will be some conversation about that as well. So I just wanted to address those since they were sort of more medically specific.
Can I just add a couple things? Because I was thinking a little bit about those, Maisie, while you're thinking about the next question to go to.
Absolutely.
I would say to also think about your national and also international think tanks. So the places where research are happening and the places where holistic connections are being made. So I think about Stanford, I think about Johns Hopkins, they are making new gains all the time with the research between the connections between mental health and gut health and biome, environment. And there's so much research about that in it, to what the optimal sort of balance of those microbes that need to be there, parasites and bacteria and all this stuff that's like healthy that needs to be there. And without it, you can have inflammatory responses, whatever. And I think chronic fatigue is different than being tired, right? So chronic fatigue, often like depression or anxiety, accompanies chronic medical illnesses. And it's real. And it's very much like, depression and anxiety. There are ways that you have to honor that too, that you just don't feel like bringing it that day, right? And maybe not to go on with the whole toxic positivity, but maybe that's an opportunity to use the skill of acting opposite to the urge to shut down and pull back and not do the thing of self-care. What we know about chronic fatigue and about medical conditions is the better we can take care of ourselves with the right amount of sleep and water and exercise and all the stuff we don't really doing in moments, the better we can do those things. It's like an ounce of prevention. It really does help the big picture. It's like flossing your teeth. You do it sort of each day and you like, is this really even doing anything? But then when you don't do it and you go to the dentist and then they do it, you're like, gums are bleeding and you're like, oh, why did I stop doing that thing? Took me 2 seconds. And so it's not about being perfect in your routines. It's about noticing when you've fallen off the track and gently saying to yourself, okay, damn, got to pick myself up and get back on track. It's not about beating yourself up when you can't do it. Sometimes you just can't, and that's okay. That's the human experience.
Definitely. And finding what that looks like for you too, finding that balance between what you're able to do and where things are just a little too much and giving yourself some grace. Totally.
Yeah.
That kind of answered our next one, actually. Do you have any tips for dealing with that chronic mental fatigue and coping? So like setting up supplies each night. So like fatigue from the daily tasks and management. Do you have anything to add, or do you feel like that kind of summed that up?
I'm still trying to figure this out for myself. Gosh, I don't feel very grown up sometimes. So I don't know how to answer this. The way I work with people is being real. And I will say that one thing my squirrel brain is not very good at, one thing I am very good at is setting up systems. One thing I'm terrible at is maintaining them for longer than 2 weeks, right? I can't tell you that I'm organizational systems I set up for myself again. I think it's just about knowing how you're hardwired and what works for you. I really envy, for example, one of my siblings who, I don't know, she must have gotten all the organizational genes and I got nothing, because her household runs like a million routines and it's so orderly. I mean, I would be a disaster in that house. But what I can say is it works for her and for them, just like I have benefits from the creativity that kind of not maintaining or the monotony. Like my brain needs a little juicing up. And even if that's, again, changing out some of the little things that bring you joy, like how you set that up. Are there ways that you can put a card there that, thinking of those like affirmations or something that's like right there that says, you have this, or good for you, or whatever it is, and something that like makes you smile and gets you again out of that automatic thinking, something that feels good about it. Some people like to mark off on the calendar. Some people are still really motivated by those star charts and things, no matter how old you are. Whatever it is that works for you, I think that's what it is, finding out what speaks to you that helps you feel a sense of accomplishment for what you are doing well, rather than focusing on, maybe those pieces that you wish you could have done differently that day. It's a both and.
Yeah. I want to speak to Jessica's comment in the chat. She said, I think the hard part is that all the additional supplies for tube feeds and PN and additional setup is a daily reminder of how you are different or abnormal. And I've been on PN for almost 30 years at this point. And a couple of tips just from that angle is find ways to build it into your routine in a way that it is something that you do not dread. So for example, I have podcast episodes that I'll put in my queue. And when I'm setting up my tubing, I will I'll put a podcast on and obviously make sure I'm paying attention to what I'm doing, but it gives me something to look forward to and kind of mentally pair it with. The other thing, I dread putting my deliveries away every single week. I have a box, a 40-pound box of fluids and supplies and all of that. there's a show on Netflix, I think it still is, called The Home Edit. And I binge watched that show, and I went through and I organized my supply closet in a way that made sense. And I had my amazing partner help me install a shelf and buy some drawers and some little clear containers. And I made it so like when I open the door to my supply closet, I'm like, ah. So I think find ways to build it into your routine that makes it less of a reminder. And also, think about the fact that Oley has nearly 30,000 members, and about a third of those are people who are either caregivers of somebody who's on nutritional support. I agree, Courtney, or are on nutrition support themselves. So it can feel really isolating, especially while you're just getting sort of established in this world, or if this is new. But just rest assured that you are not alone at all. Thank you, guys. Jordan, did you have anything to add to that about the daily mental fatigue?
Just to echo what Terry said, and those routines and finding ways to sort of trick yourself into, I run into it, it's not the same, but I run into it in maintaining my household. Like if the dogs didn't bark when they had to go out, I might forget to take them out, like those sorts of things. And so I think, finding those routines, I think pushing through some of that fatigue, sometimes that fatigue is depression related or anxiety related. And so in those cases, it really is pushing through to just do the thing. But it's very difficult sometimes.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with a little self-bribery. Like maybe you have a show that you want to watch and you can't watch it until you do your tubing or something. Figure out what works for you. Okay, we are down to our last 10 minutes. And while I was hoping we would have time for some live Q&A, there's a couple of questions that I really want to get to that may take some time. So that being said, if you have any additional questions that weren't submitted through your registration, please drop them in the chat, and I'm sure Jordan and Terry would be happy to answer them, and I can post the responses with the recording and the resources. So please take advantage of that. But the second to last question, I feel like this is fairly applicable to quite a few people. So just for some context, with nutrition support, specifically parenteral nutrition, which is delivered intravenously, there's a much higher risk of infection because of the direct access to your vascular system. So what might be some ways to deal with the anxiety of having that responsibility to manage that care, and kind of on the aftermath, the guilt if you do end up with an infection, which is a very real possibility for a lot of us. So anxiety of managing your care and guilt if it doesn't go as planned.
I could say a lot here, so I definitely want you to chime in, Jordan. I think stuff happens, and there is bacteria everywhere and staph everywhere. It's going to happen. Even with the best situations of protective steps and care, part of what happens with infection is also that our immunity is low. So it's a two-way street, because it is sort of how the foreign, bacteria or whatever enters, but also it's the individual's, immunity ability. When our immune system is working optimally, we have macrophages in our body that come and sort of gobble it up like Pac-Man and take care of it, right? But different things, stress, sleep, hydration, nutrition, all of that impacts our body's response. And so the number of times that interfaces happen and infection doesn't occur far outweigh the times that it does. And of course, that anxiety is real. one of the things that I learned about fear is it's false evidence that appears real, meaning just what I said, the number of times that the connections made and an infection doesn't occur far outweighs the number of times when it does. But of course, we remember that time that it caused a problem because we're such good perfectionists and so conscientious and caring and trying to, really seamlessly navigate these very complex, difficult situations. So patience, compassion with self, with other, it's not an easy situation. It exists everywhere. I mean, think about COVID and cancer and diabetes and any other situation where there's chronic attention and care and lots of big consequences if something is amiss, but those situations can't be avoided. They are part of living and being in a dynamic, interactive environment, short of living in a bubble. And even then, people who are, quite insulated still encounter problems.
I agree. I think, so I'm a big Mr. Rogers Neighborhood fan. And Fred had this quote that was something like, whatever is mentionable is manageable, and everything human is mentionable. And I think naming the anxiety, naming the fear is really, really important, because once you can name it, you can deal with it. And saying to your providers, I'm really anxious about getting an infection. And saying it as plainly as that. And working with them to address some of that anxiety. And then I think what happens, advocating for yourself is really, really important.
I was just going to say, adding to what you're saying, Jordan, taking that a step further is kind of what Jessica mentions is, how suddenly it all comes on and how terrible, one feels when something like that happens. That is true and real. And anyone who's ever experienced anything like that, it's a form of PTSD. When one has a chronic illness, we do get traumatized in the experience of living through it. And so if there are, for example, antibiotics that you can take with you, and you make a pact with your doctor, listen, I won't take this prescription unless I call you and we agree, but can you at least send me with preparations in case, so that it's a phone call, you say go ahead, or you ask me to check these 3 things, and then we decide whether I use it or not. But to me, going prepared helps bring my anxiety into almost the level or the window of tolerance that I can sort of navigate it a little better and more effectively. So figuring out what would help you feel prepared, and really, as Jordan was saying, advocating for that.
Definitely. Thank you. I think, Jessica, the fact that you know your body and you know well enough to identify that it was an infection is huge. I think also don't be afraid to ask for additional education about proper technique if that's something you may be concerned about, just to make sure you're checking all your boxes. Obviously don't, obsess over it to the point that it becomes a separate problem. And I think lastly, I would just say, give yourself some grace, because we are doing at home what people go to school for 12 to 15 years for, so we can only do the best we can. Okay, we have about 3 minutes. Thank you guys for dropping some questions in the chat. I know Jordan may have to hop off like a minute or so. But do you have any suggestions for working through those emotions that may come up if you are in a situation that was previously traumatic, but you have to experience it again? So if you had a fairly traumatic surgery, or something that brought on those feelings. How can you navigate those emotions if you have to go through it again?
Yeah, so as much as the brain sort of is hardwired for survival, it also does want to heal itself, ironically enough. So one of the things that I would encourage is working with a mental health provider that actually does have some evidence-informed techniques and strategies for dealing with traumatic experiences. So for example, this is just a method. It doesn't mean it's the method or the only method, but one of the things that mental health clinicians are sometimes trained intensively in is what they call EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. I don't know, it's a big old mouthful. Basically, what it means is breaking down the trauma in ways that your brain can actually process and heal through it. And it involves engaging both right and left hemispheres of your brain at the same time, and basically synthesizing the communication between those two hemispheres. And it's a specific training because it's not something that someone can generally get to just by verbally talking. It involves using what they call bilateral stimulation, whether it's eye movement or hearing sounds or tapping, basically those brain gym activities where when an individual utilizes some of those strategies, the brain's ability to deepen the healing power of it and really feel what happens is your brain is, when it's processing trauma and there's so much coming at it so fast, it misfiles kind of like a computer. And so PTSD is almost like when you turn on your computer screen, you have these unwanted pop-ups, right? And what certain kinds of therapy, such as the EMDR, it's not the only one, but it does is it really helps your brain slow down and figure out where it wants that experience, and it allows your brain to accurately file it in a place that you then can call up the intensity of the experience when you want to, rather than it coming over you, and feeling capsized by it. So I think, again, it's a pairing of those things because it's really traumatic to have something like that happen. And I do have a few more minutes, Maisie. I know probably some of our listeners don't, but I'm happy to take a few more minutes to get through these questions, if it helps.
Thank you. I think a couple, for those who do want to stick around, if not, feel free to email me some additional questions. But I think the biggest ones that I'm seeing are, how do you deal with, or what are some strategies to help a client with adherence to treatment? So maybe they're not infusing when they're supposed to be, or they're struggling with the proper procedures or protocols. So how might you help with adherence? And then we'll wrap up, but that was one that came up a couple times.
Yeah, so this answer isn't so great. It's individualized, really. It's about really understanding what is difficult about adherence for that individual.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's the whole thing and it's really an aspect of grief that has an opportunity to, be processed in a different way. Maybe it's the time of day that preparation is happening, or, I say really provocative things. So pardon me if I'm stepping outside the bounds, but maybe it's that I don't want to do this at night. I want to think about being intimate with my loved one, and I don't want to have to deal with this. It pisses me off that I really have to deal with it. I think it's about really figuring out for the individual what is the relative difficulty. It's all difficult, undoubtedly. And there are specific places that our brains can get hung up on certain things, and having the opportunity to explore that in more detail and really figure out what the nature of the challenge is, and then brainstorming not only with that person that's helped you sort of get underneath it, but other people that you trust and know you well that might have some creative solutions that you haven't thought about.
That's awesome. Thank you. And one final plug for the conference. That is where a lot of those connections take place. And that's some of the feedback we've gotten is that, the educational sessions are hugely valuable, but even more so are the conversations that happen at dinner or at some of our social events or at activities that are going on, or even just in the hallway, caregivers connecting, kids connecting. It really helps, alleviate some of that feeling of isolation and just passing on those tips and tricks that maybe people who have been on therapy for 30 years can share with somebody who has only been on it for 1 or 2. So that is a really great point in figuring out what's important for your patients and prioritizing that. So I have made note of the questions that were asked in the chat and the Q&A, and I will email those to Jordan and Terry. If it is not something they can answer, I will do my best to find some resources and share those with you. Like I said, I'll try to share some more general resources as well in the field of mental health, but I think we are going to wrap up. I'm going to share one final screen with you just because I feel like I have to. If you do want to get involved more with Oley, you can become a member. It's free. There's no cost. You'll get informed of all of our events, including our support groups, our conferences, our webinars, and mini meetings like this one. We are always looking for volunteers, both virtually and in person at our events. Attending our support groups can be hugely helpful. That's a great way to meet folks who are going through what you're going through. And following us on all of our social media channels. I am trying to make them fun and engaging. So engage with us. Again, if you have any further questions, please feel free to email me at maisie.sear@oley.org. I dropped it in the chat, but I can certainly do it again. And a huge thank you to Terry and Jordan who had to hop off, but we hugely appreciate your insight and your expertise. And I just cannot thank you enough for helping us facilitate this conversation. So,
well, I want to thank the participants. The fact that there are 40-something people attending a webinar in today's time and age is incredible. And so kudos to all of you. And I hope it was helpful. Again, this is not our area of expertise. And so we may have been off the mark. And if so, I sincerely apologize about that. Our intention, our hearts are good. And our hope is to really just empower you to live fully through your experiences. One of the questions I saw in the chat is, how do I get rid of this rage? I would say seek out a rage room and go beat the hell out of something with a bat, or break things or whatever in a safe way. They exist for a reason. And this is enraging, right? Like there are real feelings that are really intense, and it's important to honor all of them and not try to just stuff them aside, because they do kind of pile up if we can't move through them. And it's okay to have those intense feelings.
Definitely. Thank you. And just another reminder, you are not alone. There are so many of us dealing with this, myself included. And I still experience that frustration as I lug that 40-pound box of fluids up my stairs in 90-degree weather and just go, why? So I hope you all found this useful to some degree. And like I said, Courtney, thank you. We'll get that healthcare directory up and running. And hopefully this was helpful to you all. I appreciate you all so much. And like I said, this recording will be made available on the website probably in a few days. Give me a few days. We're still conference planning, and we'll try to pull together some resources for you. But thank you so much to everyone for attending, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you very much. Thanks for setting this up, Maisie, and the Oley Foundation. So important.
Thank you, Terry.